Hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Today we're going to talk about a little meeting that took place over the weekend. It was the Idaho GOP Summer Meeting. And in the grand scheme of things, there was a lot of rule making and procedural stuff. And there was a lot of minutia that was dealt with, but there were also some very clear trends that emerged that it's very clear the people of Idaho are supporting. Things like repealing the grocery tax, e-verify, etc. I've got details on the things that happened and more importantly, the things that didn't happen at this last weekend's GOP state meeting.
All reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the GOP Summer Meeting. This took place over the weekend in Pocatello, June 20th and 21st. From all accounts, it was a good meeting, not nearly as contentious as other meetings that we've seen happen throughout the state, but there was a lot of discussion about various rules, procedures, ways to make sure that the GOP is representing its interests and its voters as best it can. And I guess it probably bears mentioning, why do political parties exist in the first place? Okay, it's a fair question. And you don't have to like political parties to understand the answer is they exist for the purpose of getting people elected. It's about organizing and focusing efforts into getting candidates elected. Okay, yes, there's room for good outcomes, there's room for bad outcomes, but in particular, there were some things that came up at this year's GOP Summer Party that I really thought you would like to know a little bit about. So let's dive into it and take a look at some of the highlights here. We had a number of great people who were covering these things. This is from Local News 8, I believe in Idaho Falls, talking about delegates from all over the state voicing opinions on any changes they think need to make happen within the Idaho Republican Party. That includes public officials and lawmakers from across the state coming in to make appearances. U.S. Senator Jim Risch attended the morning session and spoke to Local News 8. Of course, this was right on the heels of Senator Mike Lee from Utah's talk about, well, maybe it's time to sell off some of the public lands. And isn't it interesting, if you look at this news story, most media outlets just simply say, sell off public lands, like he's going to sell them all. But it's only a very small portion that actually would be eligible for sale. But why not let the people who live in those areas, buy them, put them to good, productive, beneficial use? Risch, not a fan of that. And obviously there are a lot of people who aren't, some for some very good reasons. Risch said, this is not going to pass. This is not going to pass. He says, I can give you a whole list of things to lie in bed at night and worry about. Don't put this on that list, referring to, I guess, the number of Idahoans he's heard expressing misgivings about Senator Lee's proposal. So they had their chairwoman's lunch, then it was back to business, voting on rules and resolutions well into the afternoon. Idaho National Committeeman Brian Smith said they would be focusing on a repeal of Idaho's grocery tax. Now, we've heard a lot about this over the last couple of legislative sessions. So far, the legislature and GOP majority hasn't yet found the wherewithal to make it happen. But there's some very outspoken people attending this GOP summer get together, and they just came right out and said it the way that they felt it is. It's immoral. In fact, Brian Smith said it's an absolutely immoral tax to be having people be forced to pay tax on their food. You shouldn't have to pay taxes to eat the family dinner. New rules and resolutions discussed in committees were voted on by the entire body, and there was some focus on accomplishments from last year. Rightfully, they were proud, according to Chairwoman Dorothy Moon, that Proposition 1 went down in flames. 70% of people who voted turned out to vote against it. They knew the Democrat scheme to bring this voting technique in that was really wonky, wasn't going to work, and 10 other states agreed. But there was one other issue, and this is what I'm still trying to get more information on. E-verify, which means, making sure that before someone is hired, that they legally have the credentials to be working in this country. There was a resolution put forth. This is from Brian Allman from the Gem State Chronicle. His resolution 2025-44 called for stronger enforcement of immigration laws, and a clause requesting legislation for mandatory E-verify was struck in committee. So he moved to add it back on the floor, but the state central committee voted that amendment down. The rest of the resolution passed. He says he'll be writing more about the issue later in the year. I only bring this up just because it just illustrates this is a topic that is not as clear cut as it should be. Even within GOP ranks, there are plenty of people who are like, we don't want to make it harder for dairies or farmers or others to be able to access the labor pool that they need, which is kind of a subtle nod and wink to, and they're not necessarily here legally. Well, so be it, but at least the work is getting done and opportunities being provided. Yeah. GOP is going to have to come to grips with this at some point and fix that little schism within their own party. All right, let's talk about this is another news story that just popped up. Governor Little agencies throughout the state, particularly education leaders, to prepare for possible spending cuts. Now, I know spending cuts, that's going to cause some concerns. It would in any particular branch of government. So the story from Idaho Education News says that Governor Brad Little's office last month told state agency directors to make internal plans for budget holdbacks. In other words, mid-year cuts in spending. Little also placed limits on budget requests, and the two directives come as state revenue lags behind projections and major tax cuts take effect. Now, if I tell you that state tax revenue is lagging behind projections, what's the first reaction most people would have? Well, people must not be spending as much, right? Because they're not generating more money to be taxed. But for some reason, some people think, well, we're just not taxing them enough. We need to be taxing them more. And sadly, you're going to see some people wanting to take that approach. Idaho Press reported last week, state tax revenues $141.5 million below projections, while policymakers enacted $453 million in tax cuts this year. This means the state will have less revenue than projected in fiscal year 2027 and in future years. Now, they say this like this is a terrible thing. How can we starve the state that we depend on for our very sustenance and for the sun to rise? And okay, maybe it's not quite that bad. But the way that some carry on, you would think that that's what the state is in charge of. The bottom line here is that tax relief is sorely needed. And it's not just because the state needs to be running leaner, more efficient organizations. It's because the taxpayers are paying out the nose every time they fuel up their car, every time they go to the grocery store. Heaven forbid they go out to dinner. Everything is more expensive, and it's ridiculous to think that the taxpayers' relief should take a very distant second to the concerns of will this bureaucrat or that bureaucracy, get paid like it's expected. So what Wolf told agency directors was that budgets relying on state general fund dollars will now be limited to maintenance spending. Okay, so they may not get new office chairs, or they may not get, some new perks, but they'll have enough to maintain what they have. Directors must get pre-approval from the governor's office before making new spending requests that use federal or dedicated funds. Now, Wolf also told directors to internally prepare for 2%, 4%, or 6% budget holdbacks as we continue to watch economic trends at the national level. She told agency directors, that the Division of Financial Management on May 29th, the directors were sent a memo outlining the governor's expectations as the agencies prepared their budget requests ahead of next year's legislative session. Lori Wolf said that DFM issues similar guidance memos around this time every year, but the state is facing a different scenario than we've seen in the past several years, that according to Idaho Education News, which they say they obtained that information through a public records request. So that there have been GOP legislators, and frankly, to his credit, Governor Little has gone along to the extent that it is time to rein in some of that spending. So how do you suppose our friends on the other side of the aisle are reacting to this? Well, Laura Necochea, and I'm sorry for how small this print must appear, but I wanted to get to her tweet. My statement in response to Governor Little directing agencies, including the Idaho Department of Education, State Board of Education, and colleges and universities to prepare for cuts. All right, here comes the outrage. Brad Little and Republicans in the State House are fully responsible for this budget crisis. Less money? Crisis. Got it? The numbers didn't add up. The warnings were clear, but they pushed through nearly $500 million in tax handouts for the wealthy and private schools anyway. And a little class warfare thrown in just for good measure. Now, with revenue falling short, they're telling public schools, hospitals, and working families to brace for cuts. Cuts of what? Their own income or tax dollars? Because there's a difference. The tax dollars are first earned by somebody who actually does the productive work to represent the value of those dollars. But the giveaways stay in place, they say. The pain falls on everyday Idahoans. Idaho Democrats fought for honest budgeting and real priorities. Oh dear. Honest budgeting, I think, is how they would say a blank check. Real priorities, well, it's whatever the GOP is against. The Idaho Republican supermajority chose greed over good governance, and Idahoans know exactly who's to blame. And in 2026, we'll make sure they answer for it. So, what do you say? Wow, there it is, right out there in the open. Look, I know that they've got their hands full in trying to meet all of the different budgetary needs, as well as making all of the various rule and policy plans that have to go for orderly elections. Will there be a presidential caucus? Will we return to a presidential primary in March again? A lot of decisions that have to be made during the off season. But I think we can all agree that it's in our best interest for government to operate within its proper limited role. So anything that goes toward accomplishing that probably deserves a good second look. And can we get some more information on that E-Verify? I'd like to know what's up. But why is it that so many leaders are running scared from that? And should they be? I guess that's a question for another time. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
All reporters are biased. The Idaho Press Club are biased. All media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.